All right, my friends, a negative times a negative is a positive, right? Can we prove it? Can we show how it happens? For a while, I couldn't. It was just a rule I memorized back when I was in middle school. But let's look at how we can actually show that a negative times a negative makes a positive. All right. So first of all, we can look at it just very simply from this approach. If I see -1, that is simply saying that negative sign, we could read it as the opposite of. So -1 is saying the opposite of 1. So if I had -5, that would be the opposite of 5. So what about when I have this? Okay, this would be saying the opposite of -1. Well, what is the opposite of -1? It's +1. So when we have the opposite of -1, it's +1. We could also think of this as -1. There's a little understood 1 right there we could think of. -1 times -1, which is +1. Now that's one way and probably the most straightforward way, but we can also show it through a work with number lines. Now it is so crucial in elementary grades that students do work with number lines to help lay this foundation. A few things that we need to be working on in elementary grades with number lines is understanding that when I move to the right, that is moving in a positive direction. The numbers are getting larger when I move to the right. When I move to the left, that is moving in a negative direction. The numbers are getting smaller. So another thing is to help students lay this foundation is to understand one of the definitions of subtraction is the distance that two numbers are apart on the number line. So when I am looking, for example, at 5 minus 3, we know that 5 minus 3 is equal to 2, right? And that's telling us that those two numbers, the 5 and the 3, minus means we're talking about the distance between those two numbers. It's 2 units. Now it's +2. We don't get into this in elementary grades. We just look at that it's 2 units apart. But for later grades, we know it's +2 because we always finding that distance. If we start with the second number, how far would we move to get to the original number? 1, 2. 2 to the right, that's in a positive direction, +2. Now, later on, and we start dealing with where we would have negative numbers. This is not in elementary grades, but we would have 3 minus 5. Okay, there are a lot of ways we can show this. We know that 3 minus 5, I know a lot of times when we're teaching this, we say that's the same thing as 3 plus -5. At any rate, we know that 3 minus 5 is -2. How can we show that on the number line? Well, let's mark 3 and let's mark 5. Now remember, we always start with the second number. How many hops would it take for me to get back to the first number? I would go 1, 2, and I'm going to the left, so it's negative. So that is -2. Now, what about when we have something like -3 minus 5? Okay, subtraction, the subtraction is just saying, I'm finding the distance between these two numbers. I'm saying if I start at 5, how far would I have to jump and in which direction would I have to go to get to -3? All right, so let's look if we've got -3 and +5. We always start with the second number. How far would I have to jump? I would jump 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I jumped in the negative direction. So -3 minus 5 is going to be -8. All right, here's where we get to the negative times the negative, making a positive. So what if I looked at -3 minus -5? Okay, now keep in mind this subtraction is what tells me that I'm talking about the distance between two numbers. Which two numbers? The -3 and the -5. So I'll mark -5 on here. I'll mark -3. Remember that we always start with the second number. How far would I have to move? and in which direction to get to 3. Let's see. 1, 2. 2 to the right, so that would be positive 2. Now, what we do is we work with students, we can look at several patterns, and they begin to notice that what this ends up being the same thing as negative 3 plus 5, which is 2, because a negative times a negative makes a positive. Now, it can work. You can practice with other numbers. If you wanted to say practice with, well, what is 5 minus negative 2? Because negative times a negative makes a positive. That becomes 5 plus 2, so it's 7. How do we show it on the number line, though? Okay, well, again, we are talking about subtraction. So we're talking about the distance between positive 5 and negative 2. So first, we would mark those numbers. We always start with the second one. So we start with the negative 2. All right, how many do I have to move and in which direction to get to 5? So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I moved 7 to the right, so that's positive 7. So we know that 5 minus negative 2 is the same thing. Negative times a negative makes a positive. 5 plus 2, which is 7, positive 7. So again, I know this may be a different concept, a different way of looking at why a negative times a negative makes a positive. And it took me a few times to wrap my mind around it. 2 things you remember. I'm looking at the distance between those numbers. That is all subtraction is. The distance between those 2 numbers, but I'm also concerned about direction. Start at the second number. How far do I move to get to the first number? And in what directions? The idea is that students at least have this understanding of why, when we have 2 negatives, we make it a positive. Of course, eventually we want them to become fluent with that, just like we want them to become fluent with their multiplication facts at younger grades. All right, I hope that you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in another video.